Conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the mysterious world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning conmen. We will reveal the detail and the intricacies of their elaborate crimes, and uncover how they were brought dramatically to justice. In this show, the story of a man who callously conned his local community out of more than £200,000. In true psychopathic fashion, Glenn Rycroft cold-heartedly manipulated his friends, his family and his community by doing the unthinkable, pretending he had cancer.
Without doubt in my mind, Glenn Rycroft's one of Britain's biggest con men.
I think for any of us, the idea of telling your mother that you've got cancer and only a limited period of time of life left is just appalling if it's just not true.
He's hurt me, he's hurt my family, and he's hurt an awful lot of other people as well.
We're talking about people who he'd known for a very, very long time, some people who'd actually assisted him in his career, people who assisted him throughout his education, and you're talking about people who lost their life savings.
And it was a horrible feeling to have, that someone who's told you they've got cancer and you're thinking, you know, maybe they haven't.
If you can't trust this guy, who can you trust?
Glenn Rycroft grew up in Salford near Manchester in England. After leaving school, he went on to become an air steward for British Airways.
Glenn Rycroft was in his early 20s, worked for British Airways, had a good job, and very, very likeable character, very personable with people and very, very, very popular.
He was extremely plausible. He was a nice, likeable lad. You felt somewhere along the line that he was a guy that had come out of a bad background. Salford isn't the best of places to be, but was starting to make something of himself. He was setting up pension plans in the form of small businesses that he could retire on when he finished flying.
No one had a wrong word to say about him, and obviously it came as a total shock of what he was actually doing because he was so personable and likeable.
Personable and likeable, necessary traits for a successful confidence trickster, Rycroft was to become a master. His tissue of deceit began in the year 2000, long before his cruel cancer claims. He began his conman career with a straightforward and plausible financial scam. He started to approach friends and family, offering them the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to invest in a lucrative British Airways share scheme. The only trouble was the share scheme was totally fictitious. The plan was simple. People gave Rycroft money to invest on their behalf, and Rycroft pocketed all the so-called invested cash for himself.
He was a steward and said he'd been given this opportunity to invest his own money in British Airways, but he'd invest it on behalf of them through himself.
The theory of it was that if you invest for a short term, it was slightly less, a longer term would be more, but in general, you were looking at around about a 12-month turnaround and around about 20 or 23% of return on investment, depending on the type of deal that you were doing, the amount that you put in.
The majority of all his family and friends invested money in him, with expecting a return for their money within a 6-month to 12-month period.
The whole thing was an underhand scam. The scheme didn't exist, but because Rycroft had targeted people he knew, they trusted him. Little did they know that their money was being used to pay for Rycroft's newfound high-flying lifestyle.
The fact that Glenn Rycroft targeted his friends and family, local businessmen, was quite clever in as much as they already trusted him. They knew he worked for BA, so there was an element of truth in the lies that he told which made them more plausible.
It's kind of a version of what we call a high-yield investment scheme, which is where you basically con people into believing that you're offering them a unique opportunity where they can get really high returns, much higher returns they could get through any legitimate means. And it's a classic instance of something that seems too good to be true. Of course it is, but people don't see it that way. They either because they trust the con man or because they're misled by their own greed.
I would say that had Glenn Rycroft come up to a stranger's house, knocked on his door at 8 o'clock some evening and tried to sell this BA investment scam, people would have seen through it. As with a lot of fraudsters who are successful, it's the initial contact and the initial hurdles of trust that they need to get over. Glenn Rycroft didn't need to do that. The trust and the belief in him was already there.
One of his best friend's parents, his best friend's parents invested their life savings with him, cash, because they trusted him so much, and then it was a self-referral from there. Really, it stayed generally within the family circle, but then some of the families introduced other people into it, friends of theirs who Glenn Rycroft didn't know, and they also invested on the trust that they were getting from the family of how reliable he was.
In retrospect, it all seems very irrational that we could believe this, but at the time, he's a young guy, he's the right age, he's got the right kit, he's doing all the right things. From our perspective, he was an air steward and a bright, cheerful, and very respectable guy. Absolutely, totally, and utterly believable.
One of the businesses Rycroft bought with the money was a newsagent's. He leased the property from Granville Goff, and Glenn Rycroft calculatingly presented himself as a consummate young professional to draw Goff into his devious scam.
We met him occasionally to talk about different things, one of which was the investment scheme, and he would turn up smart as a new pin, blue jacket on, hat under the arm, BA tie, ready to go flying. He was on his way down to Manchester Airport to catch the shuttle down to get his flight out. And to all intents and purposes, he was a BA man, through and through. And we had no reason to believe otherwise.
It wasn't long before Granville Goff was presented with the opportunity to invest in Rycroft's devious scheme.
He suggested there was a way of being involved with his British Airways pension schemes. It seemed to be a good idea. It was offering a good rate of return. Seemed a pretty secure company to be with, and as a consequence, we got involved. He had quite a considerable number of investors, some of them quite substantial amounts of money. And basically, when I asked what we were talking about in the way of substantial amounts of money, he said at the moment he's got around about £600,000 invested of various different people as well as his own. So the 10,000 that I was looking at, just to try it out, seemed to be pretty small beer.
Friends, family and neighbours believed their money would yield a large return on their investment, depending upon the amount they initially spent. Little did they know that their return would be zero, and their invested cash would just vanish.
The money was used to fund an extravagant lifestyle, not for himself, but he actually treated his friends as well, but invariably it was basically going on trips around the world, renting a luxury apartment in Worsley, having all mod comms in the apartment, rental vehicles, buying into businesses, you name it, he basically had his hand in everything.
When Glenn Rycroft was working for the cabin crew for British Airways, he might well have seen things that really drove him to aspire to that sort of lifestyle. And I think quite often with con artists, it's not just about the material aspect, it's more about what money and status and things like that represent. So it's respect. It's more the idea of a lifestyle, and he might well have picked up on all that when he was in the cabin crew.
He went to the Bahamas, he went to Portugal, he went to Paris a number of times, and he was driving around America. I think he went there for 2 to 3 weeks, took friends with him and spent thousands.
His friends clearly thought Rycroft's investments were doing well for him in order to be able to afford to treat them to these lavish holidays.
And to give an indication of the whim of this particular character, he flew to Florida from the Bahamas purely and simply because it was overcast one day. Now, he treated some friends and took them out there completely free of charge to them. He footed the bill, and it was all stolen money that he'd conned out of people. He flew to Australia. He flew to several locations in America. And he stayed in the best resorts. He stayed at a 5-star golfing resort in Portugal. He doesn't even play golf. You know, so this is the extravagant and arrogant existence that this man carried out.
But the lucrative con did not have an exit strategy. People were expecting a return on the money they'd invested. With the clock ticking and the pressure on, Rycroft was in danger of being exposed as a fraud and a criminal. And so, many believe in an act of desperation and impulse, he played his cruel masterstroke. To evade, or at least postpone detection, Rycroft did the unimaginable. He lied to his nearest and dearest, telling them he was terminally ill.
It obviously started coming on top for Glenn Rycroft, where he would have to start paying money back. So to enforce really the deception really and facilitate him getting more money, he actually came up with a story that he was suffering from brain cancer.
Glenn Rycroft was living the high life in Salford, Greater Manchester in the UK. Working as an air steward, Rycroft approached his friends, family and neighbours with an amazingly lucrative but completely fictitious British Airways investment scheme. With his nearest and dearest expecting the rewards of the scheme at any time, Rycroft was now in danger of being cornered and caught out.
There was always going to be a fatal flaw because it had to come to an end. You know, he had a relationship with these people and they wanted to see a return on their investment, and that just wasn't going to happen. So he clearly hadn't thought of an exit strategy for this con.
A new con was born out of his BA scam in an ingenious but short-sighted exit strategy. Rycroft avoided paying out the money he owed by claiming he had cancer. In November 2000, Glenn Rycroft left his job as a cabin crew member using another lie, this time that his mother had cancer. A month later, Rycroft told his investors, friends and family a different lie. He was on sick leave and had a cancerous brain tumour.
Coming up to when people started expecting a return on the funds, it obviously started coming on top for Glenn Rycroft, where he would have to start paying money back. So to enforce really the deception really and facilitate him getting more money, he actually came up with a story that he was suffering from brain cancer and he'd been diagnosed and it was potential that he was going to die.
He came back apparently rather abruptly from one of his many meandering trips and said that he'd been diagnosed as having terminal cancer with probably less than 12 months to live.
Using cancer as a con is got to be the bottom of the barrel. It really is the most appalling way of taking money from other people.
Choosing cancer as his disease of choice, just in terms of the mechanics of his actual con, it's quite well suited because you can drag it out for a long time, but you can always be on death's door at the same time. And then plausibly you could need treatment in various other places and have to travel. So it really ticked all his boxes in that sense. In terms of the psychology of his victims, cancer is it's still a tender point. It's something that isn't talked about a great deal. Because it's quite a taboo area, it probably maintains quite a lot of mystery around it. So therefore it makes sense in terms of the psychology of his victims. They're not likely to probe too much, they're not likely to ask too many questions, too many awkward questions. So in that sense, it's a really good choice.
It's just something that you find very hard to come to terms with. I mean, just think of your own loved ones. Can you imagine going home tonight and saying to them, look, I've got 2 months to live, I'm dying of a brain tumour. Just think of the emotion and the difficulty that would take. It's just unbelievable that anybody would stoop to such a callous and calculated deception as that. But this lad did, and he did it with no remorse whatsoever.
Well, it's torturous, I would have thought, on his mother, because his mother's a nice person. Same with his sisters, they're nice.
I think for any of us, the idea of telling your mother that you've got cancer and only a limited period of time of life left is just appalling if it's just not true. I mean, none of us could really understand how someone can do that unless you have this sort of psychopathic tendency to detach yourself emotionally from the situation.
No one's going to ask a dying man, no one's going to ask him difficult questions about a business plan, no one's going to put him on the spot in terms of coughing up money that they've invested. So you could argue that that's a sort of diabolical way of sidestepping the consequences of his initial scam. I'm not sure that he was necessarily that calculating, because quite often psychopaths aren't. In fact, he said himself that when he claimed to have cancer, it was just something that just occurred to him. He didn't know why he did it. He just started saying that.
I think Glenn Rycroft exhibits quite a few traits of a psychopath. He has this emotional detachment, lack of conscience, and the ability to con people that he knew and who loved him.
With the cancer con successfully born out of his British Airways scam, Rycroft was safe for now. And like any master conman, Rycroft thoroughly researched his subject matter, so he was utterly convincing.
His initial research into the disease, the symptoms, the treatments was all painstakingly taken on board by him. We know from speaking to close associates who were victims and witnesses in the case that he used to spend quite a lot of time on the internet. So the World Wide Web is a reservoir of endless information that he researched. He also purchased medical books, specifically about oncology and similar subjects, medicines that people might use for treatment and the like.
And he created quite a plausible scenario for people to believe. And most of us are very sympathetic and have empathy for people who have serious illness.
To facilitate this stage of the con, Rycroft ensured no one questioned his fictional illness, and he audaciously began to dramatically and disturbingly display the symptoms of a man with cancer.
In order to convince people of his illness, Rycroft would look very gaunt. He would tell people he was tired and not feeling well. He would display hair loss. He actually shaved his head and gave people the general impression that he'd received chemotherapy. There was one particular evening that one of the witnesses recounts. They were in the home and Rycroft went out of the lounge, only to return several minutes later screaming in pain and displaying what looked like blood running from his ears, his nose, his eyes and his mouth. We now know that he actually went to a joke shop in Manchester and purchased fake blood capsules. And when I spoke to the individuals about that, they were so shocked and traumatised at being suddenly confronted with this that even today they find it hard to come to terms with that somebody could be so callous as to do something like that.
Not content with disturbing and upsetting those closest to him, he then set about conning them out of their cash.
Rycroft's friends and associates were so trusting of him that when he confronted them with symptoms, they accepted anything that he was prepared to say. Bearing in mind that Rycroft was saying that he was receiving treatment from the National Health Service and from Bupa, he was quoting these medical organisations to his friends, and what would happen is they would do what he asked. And if he said, "I don't need an ambulance," they wouldn't get one. He would say that this is all part of the symptoms and to trust him, which is what people did. They were really taken in by him.
It was quite clear that he could just lie on the cuff. I mean, some of the stories that he come up with are absolutely, to this date, when I've sat here now 3-4 years down the line, are still unbelievable and still amaze me when I think back about what he used to say. Yeah, he would just, anything at all, he would lie about anything, and I have no qualms about the type or how extravagant the lie was. It wouldn't bother him one little bit. People
gave to what they firmly believe was an honest and worthy cause, and that would be to try and finance the private research and treatment of Glenn Rycroft, believing genuinely that he was a cancer sufferer.
In all honesty, I thought it was a genuine attempt to raise money for a lad who was on death's doorstep.
It was just a tissue of lies and deceit that he wove to convince people of his illness.
In true psychopathic fashion, Rycroft convinced his community that nothing could be done for him in Britain, but a letter from a fictitious Professor Knowles stated there was hope elsewhere, with a hefty price tag.
He'd actually identified that there was a treatment in Australia that wasn't recognised by the British Medical Board, but it was very, very expensive, £250,000, and needed money to go over, because that was possibly his only chance of actually being able to beat the condition that he had. He managed to get hold of a letter-headed paper from Steppenwell Hospital and have it copied onto blank paper, obviously, at a local stationery's. From there, he typed up a letter confirming from an alleged consultant professor that he had this condition that he was purported to have.
Rycroft targeted local business people, including Ray Fisher, to help fund his bogus treatment. And Glenn Rycroft looked every inch the cancer victim.
It was a family friend who introduced Glenn to myself and mentioned that he was poorly and he was looking for anyone who could make a donation for some treatment in Australia. Well, he turned up at the office, he had a baseball cap on, he'd pulled down over his face, he'd lost a lot of weight, he didn't look well. We had a letter from Stepping Hill Hospital from a specialist saying that he has a brain tumour. And he said the treatment is available, but not in this country. There's one chance he's got of getting out to Australia and getting the treatment paid for privately because it's not available in Britain on the NHS. And the letter was signed by some professor from Stepping Hill.
Like many others, Ray Fisher fell for the scam and agreed to help a dying man.
I was getting updated phone calls saying he needs 150, 350, then it was coming back down. Someone else had donated some, so I was getting like a running commentary on how much he needed. And I think the final amount was 30,000. I said, well, I can't run to 30, but I can run to 15. As the morning I approached him to come and pick the cheque up, it was all done over mobiles. So it's all getting harassed and busy at work. I'm getting Myra on the landline, I'm getting Myra on the mobile phone. He said he needs the money, he's got a plane waiting at the airport. Like an idiot, I fell for it.
Rycroft told some of his victims that he had a plane on standby and that therefore it was waiting for him and he needed the money quickly, he needed them to act quickly. And that's a classic form of what's called deadlining in con game parlance, which is a form of a hurry-up. It's a way of pressuring people into giving you the money quickly so they don't have time to have any doubts, they don't have time to think twice about things, they just have to act. And they act on the rationalisation they've already made, which is they trust you, they want to help you. So by deadlining them, you make them cough up there and then.
He said he had the airplane waiting at Manchester Airport to fly him straight off. So I didn't give us any breathing time at all. It was just sheer pressure what he put us under.
People started actually investing into a trust where he could receive treatment to try and save his life. And it just facilitated really that deception again, and he still maintained his lifestyle because now the money wasn't coming in for the investments, it was coming in for his cancer treatment.
The new phase of the con was successfully up and running, and Rycroft again started to see the world on other people's money. People thought they were funding Rycroft in a desperate bid to save his life, sending him around the world to meet with leading cancer experts and to be treated with groundbreaking remedies. The reality was he was using the charitable donations to enjoy extravagant holidays. He would often take along his friends who believed they were supporting Rycroft through grueling treatments. They didn't know that the whole scenario was in fact a cruel, manipulative scam, and that they, like everyone else, were actually being betrayed. While abroad with friends, Glenn Rycroft was careful to never let the facade of the tragic cancer victim slip. He would disappear on the pretense that he was going to have potentially life-saving treatments, and his friends were none the wiser. He would sometimes return with physical signs that he'd undergone treatment. On one occasion he returned with a ball patch on the back of his shaved head to represent surgery. It was all a con.
To facilitate that deception, he would disappear for days on end, saying he'd go through the treatment. He wanted to go through it on his own. He didn't want them to put through. It was very painful treatment, etc. So he'd give them money and say, "Look, you look after yourself for 2 days, and I'll go away." And he'd basically go and book into a motel or another hotel. Every time he went over there, he always stayed at 5-star resorts, and lived the high life.
None of Glenn Rycroft's friends wanted to speak about their experiences in this documentary.
I think in Glenn Rycroft's case, it was a combination of the financial gain, but also living that high life, and the sympathy and empathy that was being poured on him by other people was obviously irresistible as well.
The reliance on the kindness of his community would inevitably become his downfall. Back in Salford, Greater Manchester, England, the local community were taking matters into their own hands. Rycroft had underestimated their generosity and the number of people now rallying to his cause.
When he started the cancer story, basically it went out of his control then, because family and friends involved other people outside of that circle of trust that he'd created, where everything that he could say in there was believable.
By expanding the pool of his victims, he was running a big risk, because by restricting them to friends and family, he had an automatic fail-safe, if you like, which is that they're much less likely to doubt him because they trust him already, whereas outsiders are much more likely to be suspicious. And that's a general rule in con games, is that the fewer people you can involve, the better, basically.
I don't think he realised that he would get as much attention as he did get when he came up with the story that he was dying of cancer.
In order to raise money for his life-saving treatments, a benefit night was organised at the local rugby club that he used to work at. That night, in honour of Glenn Rycroft, would be the evening that exposed his web of lies and secured his downfall.
I spent a sleepless night. I mean, can you imagine? I live in a local community where everybody knows this chap, and I'm going to be the one that says, well, actually, I don't think this chap's got cancer.
Former air steward Glenn Rycroft had swindled his local community of Salford, Greater Manchester, England, out of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Firstly, by offering them the chance to invest in a fictitious British Airways bond scheme, and then by claiming he had a cancerous brain tumour.
He was very, very convincing, very, very personable guy, and consequently you would talk with him, discuss things with him, totally and completely believe in the things he was describing. And to suddenly find out that the whole thing was fraudulent, completely and utterly devastating. If you can't trust this guy, who can you trust?
But Glenn Rycroft's cancer con couldn't go on forever, and soon it was to come crashing down.
Rycroft's bubble eventually burst, and it burst on the night at the premises behind me here, the Willows. This was as a result of a charitable event that had basically been organised by his family and friends. They put a huge amount of commitment into securing variety acts who were given of the services next to nothing for no cost to anybody. And on the face of it, it looked like it was going to be a tremendous evening and it would raise a lot of money.
A night of entertainment, singing and fundraising, all in Rycroft's honour. But for once, Rycroft wasn't the most willing of beneficiaries, and he was keeping his distance.
He wasn't turning up for meetings. One of the organisers who was organising the variety acts, he himself was a cancer sufferer, and had tried to speak to Glenn about it to see whether he needed any counselling, any support and the like, and Rycroft was distant. He was careful not to speak to him, simply because this man would have seen straight through his ruse and his deceptions.
In another unexpected twist of fate, the compere for the night worked for British Airways, Rycroft's former employers.
A very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to Glenn Rycroft's benefit evening. All the money raised this evening was all going to a very good cause. We've got some wonderful acts on.
Debbie Henley also tried to speak to Glenn Rycroft prior to the benefit evening.
I did on several occasions try to contact him, but unfortunately I was unable to get hold of him on his mobile phone. I eventually got hold of him and he was very curt with me on the phone. I put this down to the fact that maybe he was having treatment and wasn't very well. I explained to him that my job as a compere was to get as much money on the evening as I could for him, and that we'd love to get British Airways involved. I had heard from the organisers that British Airways had given a large sum of money as for tickets, etc., as a prize for the raffle. And I said to Glenn, well, let's get hold of BA News, which is a company newspaper. British Airways employees are exceptionally generous, and let's get hold of them, get them involved and get as much money as we can. He then became very defensive and said that he didn't want British Airways News getting involved at all, and in fact he'd heard that I worked for British Airways and didn't want me comparing the evening for him at all. Again, I found it a bit odd, but put it down to the fact that he wasn't well. And I just explained to him that unfortunately I would be the lady that was doing the evening, and my job was to get as much money as I possibly could for him.
But this was just the beginning of Debbie Henley's suspicions.
On a few occasions, I'd asked, would Glenn be available at the rehearsal so that I could have a chat with him, see if he thought he'd be okay for the evening to come and collect his cheque, or did he want somebody else involved? And on many occasions, people would tell me that Glenn wouldn't be there. He was having 2 and 3 amounts of radiotherapy per day, and unfortunately, he wasn't well enough to attend the evening. On a few occasions, people would say that he'd gone to have his treatment, and I'd ask, well, who's bringing him home, if family helping him, and he'd say no, he's driving himself home after the treatments because it's very upsetting for people to see him in such a state. He'd rather not upset anybody and keep it all to himself.
What basically happened was that several people involved in the organisation started to have slight concerns, not something they could specifically put the finger on.
Little things started to add up, and when I was chatting to people, different little things that, British Airways had loaned him £30,000 for treatment. Now, British Airways are a very, very generous company, and they do look after their employees wonderfully. However, they're not a charity either, that, you imagine the amount of people that do fall in a company. They couldn't do this for everybody, and it all seemed a little bit odd. We then heard that he'd been out to Australia to get life-saving treatment, and this clinic that he'd gone to did have a cure for cancer, but Glenn had to sign a contract to say that he would never divulge where this company was or the kind of treatment that he'd had. That's when alarm bells started to go, that I thought, well, whoa, there's somebody out there with a cure for cancer, and they're not sharing it with everybody.
Rycroft's cruel cancer con was about to unravel and crash down around him.
I think the final straw was when a chap came up to me, one of the organisers, and we were just chatting briefly about the evening and how it was going. And he said, British Airways are such a marvellous company, aren't they? Glenn was telling me that they've got a jet on standby to take him anywhere in the world should a cure for cancer come up. And I think that was when the penny dropped, and I thought, even the chief executive of British Airways would not have a jet on standby. It's just not on. It wouldn't happen ever. And that was when I thought, there's something not right. And it was a horrible feeling to have, that someone who's told you they've got cancer and you're thinking, maybe they haven't.
Obviously, she worked for British Airways, that British Airways would never do anything like that. And that's where really the scepticism crept in and people started asking questions. And from there it snowballed, really.
I spoke to one of the organisers at the Willows, and I said, there's just something not right here. And one of the organisers said to me, yeah, we kind of feel that, it could, that there is something untoward going on. I said, well, I'm going to have to speak to British Airways tomorrow. I spent a sleepless night. I mean, can you imagine? I live in a local community where everybody knows this chap, and I'm going to be the one that says, well, actually, I don't think this chap's got cancer. When I did finally ring British Airways and speak to them, and they told me that, Glenn no longer, because everybody in the community still presumed that Glenn worked for British Airways, that Glenn hadn't worked for the company for some months. It was just awful. It was just sickening.
Positive now of foul play, Debbie phoned the police, but with the benefit the next day, the show just had to go on.
Well, we went ahead with the evening, and when I got up on the stage to thank everybody for coming, I did explain to them we would be giving all the money that evening to Pendlebury Children's Hospital, and there were a few ums and ahs and a few people wondering, well, I've come for Glenn, but that was the only way that we could get the evening to go ahead.
It was then that the full extent of the cold-hearted con started to become clear.
When I came off the stage after the raffle, there was a queue of people waiting to speak to me. It's a small community round here. It doesn't take long for people to find out what you do for a living. And there was a lady waiting there, and she said, you know, I believe you work for British Airways. So I said, yes, I do. She said, well, would you let me know how my shares are doing? She said, because Glenn took my money a few months ago, and I've been trying to contact him, and he's not got back to me to let me know when I'll be getting all my money. And my stomach, I could physically have been sick, because I just then thought, this is bigger than any of us thought. So I said, well, actually, I haven't any idea about your British Airways shares, but if you give me a name and address, I'll take your name and address and I'll get straight back to you. Behind her was somebody else. In the end, there was about 9 people queuing up to ask how their British Airways shares were doing, and I didn't have a clue. You know, I've worked for the company for 20 years, and I certainly didn't know anything about any British Airways shares.
The whole thing just started to unwind, and once it started to unravel, it became a total nightmare. He went from being the good guy to being just unbelievably involved in any number of dirty tricks. And that really is very, very disturbing.
After the evening was over, I was back in the dressing room behind the stage, and a gentleman came to me and said, Glenn's here and he wants to speak to his compere. To which, again, my stomach was already in knots anyway. I just went around the curtain and looked down the room, and there was a willowy figure of a man at the back with a hat on, and I just couldn't speak to him. I was just so appalled by what had gone on that evening, and I just couldn't speak to him at all. I just went back into the dressing room.
And Debbie Henley's worst fears were soon proven right.
I spoke to the management here at the Willows, and they told me that because of slight suspicions some of the organisers had been having, they had actually asked Rycroft to produce a letter from his doctor. A letter was produced, and that was presented to me when I first came to it, and it was purporting to be from a Professor Knowles of Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport. The British Medical Association told us that there was no such person as Professor Knowles, certainly not working at Stepping Hill Hospital, and certainly not involved in the field of oncology.
In fact, not only was the doctor fictitious, but Stepping Hill Hospital, Stockport, England, didn't even have a cancer department. Rycroft was arrested on suspicion of fraud by the police and interviewed.
He was told he was being arrested on suspicion of deception, and he made a full and frank admission to us there and then. Travelling back to the station, he actually suggested, quite unsolicited, that it was a pack of lies. And in the subsequent interviews that we conducted with him under caution, with the solicitor present, he fully admitted that he'd never had cancer. The British Airways investment bonds never existed. He made a complete, full and frank admission of the criminal actions that he'd carried out.
During the house search, not only did we recover these medical journals with highlighted areas in which highlighted the conditions he had, we also recovered receipts for blood capsules purchased from a joke shop, which would have been conducive with him collapsing and blood pouring from his nose and mouth, which his family witnessed.
And the word quickly spread around the community.
The next thing I find out is that there are, in actual fact, an awful lot of other people that have been in the same situation who have invested with the BA scheme. And essentially, this was a completely new and separate scam to the cancer scam that had initially caused the problems to come to light.
The whole thing's been a scam. So I didn't feel too... It didn't really sink in. I didn't feel too bothered about the money at that time. It's only when everything else comes to light and the way you think you've been deceived and manipulated. I think that's what hurt the most, being taken for the mug.
On leaving the police station, I remember quite vividly saying to him that you need to go and tell your mother and your family that you're not dying. You've got to make a clean breast of things and be honest with them. And he assured me that he would do that.
Rycroft, seemingly unable to keep his promise and face his family, in a cruel twist decided to genuinely take himself to death's door.
What he'd done, he'd gone out that night and put petrol on himself in his motor car and deliberately crashed it into the central reservation on the M62 motorway over in West Yorkshire.
Glenn Rycroft cruelly conned and manipulated his friends, his family and his local community of Salford, Greater Manchester, England. Rycroft's first con started in the year 2000. He convinced people to invest in a bogus investment scheme where he used people's life savings to fund his extravagant lifestyle. The following year, when it looked as if Rycroft was in danger of being caught, he did the unthinkable. He lied and told his nearest and dearest he was dying of cancer. In a dramatic twist, when the scam was uncovered, Rycroft seemed unable to cope with the revelation and decided to really try to end his life.
He'd been in the police station more or less all day, but that evening had jumped in his car, driven over the other side of the Pennines, and had a serious attempt to commit suicide. Doused the car with petrol, driven it into the Armco barrier, turned it over, set it on fire. A van which was following had screeched to a halt, and the guys inside it had leapt out without thought for themselves and pulled him out of the burning wreckage.
It would be easy to read that as a kind of gesture of remorse, but I'm not sure that that would be right, because given the appalling things this guy tried to pull off, he obviously didn't really have much of a conscience. I don't think remorse was in his vocabulary. So one suspects that it wasn't really to do with remorse, it was maybe more to do with panic or embarrassment, or it's just, as part of his psychopathy, it's about acting on impulse quite often.
This seemed to be his solution, rather than facing the consequences, to put an end to it. Difficult to say, but in some respects it may have been better for all of us if he had.
With the man who claimed he had cancer now lying in hospital, it was left to Detective Sergeant Steve Retford to break the news to Glenn Rycroft's family that their son and brother had never actually had cancer.
I was confronted the next day with a call, a physical call. She came to the police station of his mother and one of his sisters when they were asking what on earth Glenn had been up to. And I simply said to them, has he not explained to you? Has he not explained to you what the arrest yesterday was all about? Clearly he hadn't done. One act that any police officer, when they join the job, finds very, very difficult is delivering a death message to somebody to say that the nearest and dearest has just been killed in a road traffic collision or industrial accident or the like. I had an experience in reverse, in that I told his mother and one of his sisters that their son and brother was not going to die in several weeks' time from a brain tumour. And the reaction from his mother and his sister were similar reactions that you would say to somebody if they just lost somebody. They were absolutely distraught. They were both in tears. It took some time before they could compose themselves and I could speak to them. They thought that he was dying, and it was just a pack of lies, and they were absolutely decimated by the news, albeit good news, that he wasn't going to die. They thought he was, and this is the way that this character deceived his own family.
With Rycroft's recovery came the court case, and in December 2003, 27-year-old Glenn Rycroft stood trial in Manchester, England. Although pleading guilty to 25 of the 30 charges of deception, Glenn Rycroft refused to take responsibility for his actions and the devastation he had caused. Instead, he turned the tables on his community and claimed that his actions were as a result of being brainwashed by a local cult called the Community of Free Spirits.
He claims that he'd been manipulated by a local cult group run by a neighbour of his for many years, since in fact he was a small child.
Rycroft's shocking and disturbing claims that he had been abused and controlled from a young age by a neighbour were fully investigated by the police, and once again his words were found to be nothing more than malicious and vicious lies.
The fact that he came up with this explanations in court saying that he'd been influenced by a cult was just the last in a whole long line of lies. It was yet another lie, thinking on his feet to try and get himself out of his situation.
But it certainly sounds in keeping with the pattern of a psychopath or a sociopath, which is what you might call confabulation, which is when you make up stories, but really on the spur of the moment. You're just improvising as you go along. And it does sound like the desperate last throw of the dice of a cornered con man is to try and pull yet another con, basically, and some more sleight of hand to say, oh, actually, all along, it wasn't what it seemed, it was something else altogether. And so, in a way, he's trying to pull his biggest con.
I think the fact that the judge threw it out meant that he had truly been exposed for what he was, and nobody was prepared to believe anything he said anymore.
It was the end of the road for Glenn Rycroft and his emotionally manipulative lies. His dramatic and unfounded claims of an inexplicable cult controlling his every whim were rejected by the judge, and the callous cancer con man received a custodial sentence.
At the trial, Glenn Rycroft pleaded guilty to 25 counts of deception and received a 4-year sentence, which is a good sentence for deception offences. And I think the reason for that is because of the damage it done to charitable organisations within the Salford community.
The judge described Glenn Rycroft as a mean, wicked and heartless con man. It is estimated he made £200,000 from his deceptions.
We lost 10,000 in cash. The rest of it is money that was set up to be made, which effectively vanished in the haze.
Minimal money was ever recovered because of the lifestyle he had. He was basically, he was living a millionaire's lifestyle, flying out to any destination he wanted to, when he wanted to, and renting a flat that cost thousands of pounds a month anyway.
I think the biggest loss by an individual victim was just over £50,000. Collectively, it was between £200,000 and £250,000. So in the bigger picture of things, you might say that there are con men around who've secured far in excess of that. I would agree with that. But what I would agree, where Rycroft is right up there with the cruelest and biggest con men, is the fact that it's the scams that he used to tell somebody, your nearest and dearest, that you are dying of cancer and have got limited weeks, months to live, when it's a complete pack of lies. It says a lot about the individual.
I think the reason that cancer was used as a scam was because nobody would question it. It's one of those taboo subjects that you could never believe that anybody would wish it on themselves or even pretend that they had it. It's one of those areas that nobody would ever question, and I think that is why he got away with it for as long as he did.
The community fell for it. His immediate family, his parents, his brothers, his sisters, his in-laws, his best friends, all fell for it. And that's why they all of them were victims of Glenn Rycroft, really. And Salford was a victim at the end of it, because it's obviously harmed Salford in relation to future charity events.
Glenn Rycroft served 2 of his 4-year sentence and has returned to Salford in England, a community that will never be the same after Rycroft's merciless manipulation of their charity and their goodwill.
The damage he'd done in the Salford community, it created distrust in the community of any events that were coming up in the future. It would take a long time for that trust to come back. It made them people who are all investing in it very sceptical in the future, investing in it again. So quite a substantial amount of damage I feel it'd done.
As a community, the people were just absolutely gutted, especially business people who had, invested or given money thinking that he was dying of cancer. There was an element of embarrassment, there was anger, there was upset, especially for the people that he was very close to, that he'd conned, and almost the relief that, thank God he's not got cancer, but oh my God, you know, how has he done this to us? Why has he been able to do this? How has he been able to get away with this? You know, that's the big question I think everybody was asking. And I think some people, including myself, felt quite foolish. And they shouldn't feel foolish at all because, you know, the nature is that they did feel sorry and they wanted to help.
Put me off making donations to anybody else. Still do little bits for charity and that, but I don't do anything as substantial as that.
Glenn Rycroft still adamantly claims that his actions were the result of years of indoctrination into a secret cult within his community. A cult which no one has been able to find any evidence of. Like the judge who sentenced Rycroft to prison, most people are now certain that Rycroft is indeed a cruel, callous conman.
He's hurt me, he's hurt my family, and he's hurt an awful lot of other people as well.
Without doubt, one of the biggest con men I've ever come across, because and the stories that he elaborated during the course of the investigation were unbelievable, you know, and still, as I said, still amazes me to this day. But and you know, I think he's one of the people who, you know, he's shown no remorse whatsoever for what he's done, and thinks still he's done the right thing.
And I could certainly well do without ever meeting anybody like that again.
In this show, the incredible tale of one of Britain's most prolific and compulsive con men, whose criminal career spans more than a quarter of a century and who has adopted at least 24 known aliases. His cons not only rob people of their money, but they also put people's lives in grave danger.
Paul Bint is a travelling serial con man.
He is a 41-year-old man who has been appearing before the courts from the age of 16. He's a man who lives in a fantasy world.
Sort of people that Paul Bint impersonated were all figures of authority, very clever people, professional people who were looked up to and admired. That's obviously something he felt he couldn't have in his normal life, and he needed it and craved it.
I've never ever come across a con man like Paul Bint. He is very much a one-off.
Paul Bint has committed more than 100 offences and audaciously posed as doctors in hospitals, an aristocrat, a playboy, a property magnate, and even masqueraded as Orlando Pownall QC, the barrister who worked on the infamous Jill Dando murder trial in the UK. Such a relentless confidence trickster, the British press has crowned him King Con.
He's so deeply involved in playing these characters, and the temporary status and success that he achieves through them, that he can't kind of give them up. I guess he's kind of addicted to them. The thing that I guess makes him unusual, and that various forensic and criminal psychiatrists have concluded, is that there's no salvation in this story. He doesn't really seem to be coming to his senses at all.
And hospitals, it would seem, are the backdrop for his fantasy world. A hospital to him would be like Disney World to a 6-year-old.
And it was in hospitals that Paul Bint's first known con began. Incredibly, this man with no medical or surgical training whatsoever walked into a hospital in Kettering, Northants, England in 1983, posing as a locum doctor. Paul Bint stole a white coat and stethoscope and set to work, plundering from the sick and the dying and stealing from his so-called colleagues. A year later, Paul Bint was pulling exactly the same disturbing con in the capital at the Whittington Hospital, North London, England. On the A&E ward of the Royal Whittington Hospital, Bint assumed the identity of Dr. Dominic York. Bint had discovered that Dr. York had gone to work in the USA and so simply claimed he had returned to the UK sooner than expected. The man who coolly strolled into Whittington, using it as his hunting ground, cruelly took his con even further. When wearing his white coat, he perilously set to work as a doctor on the wards. While at the North London Hospital, despite no training, Paul Bint relished and performed a variety of tasks. He arranged x-rays, attended to a patient with a collapsed lung, and administered 12 stitches to a man with a head injury.
He'd managed to sneak his way into various hospitals, mostly in London it seemed during that period, steal a doctor's coat, often steal a stethoscope or other equipment or a pager.
Well, as soon as he put on the white coat, he was instantly, if you like, short-circuiting people's doubt and mistrust reaction. They were automatically inclined to trust him because they thought he was a doctor. So they're therefore going to put a lot more weight in things that he says. Now, how he was able to carry it on from there, I think it speaks a lot to his conman characteristics. He's obviously able to improvise and to talk a good game. He's able to sound convincing. Classic characteristics of a conman.
When talking about infiltrating the Royal Whittington Hospital in London, England, Paul Bint dubiously claims he studied medical books for 6 months, went through an interview process and won the position over 23 qualified doctors.
When I put to him that he was playing God with people's lives, that he was putting lives at risk, he said that, no, he'd studied the medical books. If there was something he wasn't sure of, he'd always refer it. And he claimed that he acted responsibly. I mean, that, again, just shows you the level of self-deception that's going on with such an individual.
The reality was he was an unremarkable man who had strolled in off the street and terrifyingly consulted with patients and administered treatments to seriously ill people. From the Whittington Hospital, Bint did shifts at St Bartholomew's Hospital in East London and the Hammersmith Hospital. At these British hospitals, his disturbing, dangerous and reckless behaviour continued.
It's fairly well documented that he did do a number of very alarming things, such as putting stitches in a man who came into accident and emergency with a head wound. He changed the drip on somebody, I think, come round after surgery. There was even a claim that he was present during emergency heart surgery in one hospital in London. So he was involved in some very serious medical situations.
He was putting lives potentially at risk by doing that, and he was manipulating them at a time when they were at their most vulnerable.
By arrogantly assuming the role of doctor, Paul Bint had found the perfect con and playground to support an extravagant lifestyle and to also fulfil his own warped fantasies of self-importance and grandeur.
By putting on a doctor's coat, you're taking advantage of what you might call the authority effect or the white coat effect, because doctors are a class of society who automatically command a lot of trust, and that's something that conmen often do. They often pose as an authority figure.
And of course, people would respond to him very differently as Dr. Bint than Mr. Bint. So he would gain respect, he would have the trust of other people, which of course would allow him to exploit them.
I think Paul Bint obviously became a little bit of a Walter Mitty type character. He believed he was a doctor, he believed he had power over these patients and that he was giving them care and attention in the way that a doctor would.
A good question is whether or not he realised that he was endangering people's health, or maybe even their lives, let alone their emotional state. And again, you have to ask whether he may have realised it, I don't know, but he probably didn't care, even if he did realise it, because he probably didn't have the same emotional processes that normal people have, so he didn't have a conscience in the same way that you and I would.
And this was just the beginning of a notorious and compulsive conman career. No one could predict the audacity and extremes Paul Bint would go to, his crimes only limited by his own imagination and fantasies. When off duty from his surgical scam, nightclubs were Bint's prowling ground of choice. He would use his false identities to seduce women, but he wouldn't just steal their hearts, he would steal their cash.
I mean, it's anything from him claiming to have slept with 1,000 women, and countless aliases, I think, from kind of aristocrats to kind of double-barreled barristers. And even one of his defence counsels actually said he makes Walter Mitty look like a 9 o'clock newsreader.
Paul Bint is a serial conman whose career has spanned 3 decades of shocking and unsettling scams. In the early 1980s, he infiltrated hospitals posing as a doctor and dangerously administered treatments to unsuspecting patients waiting for the care and attention from professional medical staff.
He often justified it by saying he was there on the front line, he probably saved a few lives, he pored over medical books, He'd done his research, he was responsible. If there was something he didn't know, he described it as a kind of sequential process being in an accident emergency. You would pass on a particular problem.
It's easy to get sidetracked by the fact that he'd taken on this persona of a doctor and was in the environment of hospitals. He was just a con man in the basic sense of the term, using that environment in order to get money from people.
But it wasn't just wish fulfillment and money on Paul Bint's mind. He used his fake status to practice his bedside manner outside the hospital. When not putting patients' lives at risk with his scandalous surgical scam, he compulsively scoured nightclubs in search of women. Bint claims to have slept with 1,000 women. He would take them to bed and then take their money. Paul Bint reportedly attempted to seduce women in nightclubs with the immortal line, "Trust me, I'm a doctor."
Supposedly one of his girlfriends said that was one of his pickup lines, where they're in a nightclub, he supposedly was fondling her breast and he says, "OK, trust me, I'm a doctor."
The reality of it is that Paul Bint would have been treated quite differently by females if they believed that he had the power and status that go with being a doctor. But crucially, he would have had more confidence when he was playing out those roles. So he wouldn't be able to impress women maybe on a normal day-to-day basis as himself, but as Dr. Bint or Barrister Bint, then of course he's going to have more charm, more confidence, and he's going to be more able to woo the ladies.
In all of my cases, women featured. It's part of his game, yes.
It's kind of interesting that he seems to have managed to con women of a certain age and education, often career women who are very, very successful in their lives, enjoying good careers and doing very well. And perhaps they kind of buy in just a little bit too much to the idea of who he is. Some of the women that I spoke to said that he can be a very kind of caring lover. And because he'd managed to, I guess, obtain a certain amount of money through other criminal work, he would often spend quite a lot of money on these women. It would always be with the idea that he was going to con them out of a much greater sum of money at the end.
Whilst serially conning women, Paul Bint could not keep away from hospitals. But his first run of success as a con man could not last forever. In 1983 and 1984, when Bint was posing as an A&E doctor, his life-threatening lies caught up with him, and he was arrested.
In the 80s, he received a couple of sentences. The first one was about 18 months for stealing doctors' coats and equipment and posing as a doctor. It's been claimed on many occasions by various defence counsels that he's suffering from some kind of mental illness or psychosis. In 84, and the judge didn't accept it for 1 minute because she could see that he'd been operating in a very irresponsible and potentially life-threatening way and gave him a very stiff sentence of 5 years. Not that, of course, he'd learned anything from it.
After being released from prison, Paul Bint quickly returned to his Walter Mitty ways, but this time he adopted a brand new tack. He decided that the best way to con his way to richness, status, and into women's bedrooms was to adopt the personas of a string of wealthy, eminent, and successful individuals. He stole the tools necessary to create the illusion of wealth and status. Although no one can tell if he stole to convince people he was successful and wealthy, or if he convinced people he was successful and powerful in order to help him steal. He seemed to need both equally. He claimed to be the Duke of Arundel and invented the persona of a wealthy aristocrat called Piers Oppenheimer in order to successfully scam and seduce, but the police were always on his tail. They arrested him several times, and in 1988 he found himself back behind bars serving a 4-year sentence.
If he believes he is Piers Oppenheimer or he is, a double-barreled surnamed leading barrister, that's enough for him, and he'll ride it for as long as he can. So I think you probably need to have, on a deeper psychological level, you need to have extremely low self-esteem, and you need to have a commitment to see it through, even though you know it's going to catch up with you eventually.
The sort of people that Paul Bint sort of impersonated or took on personas of were all figures of authority, very clever people, professional people who were looked up to and admired. And that's obviously something he felt he couldn't have in his normal life, and he needed it and craved it.
In 1993, released from prison, Paul Bint reverted to his old hunting ground of hospitals. Once again, he would put seriously ill patients' lives at risk by posing as a doctor in a bid to feed his ego and his wallet. In 1993, he infiltrated St James's Hospital in Leeds, England, before breaching security at the nearby York District Hospital, where the cold-hearted con reached new heights in terms of its cruelty towards Bint's victims.
He told the parents of a 17-year-old girl who'd just been involved in an accident that their daughter would live, and 6 hours later she died. Now, you could say that's emotionally reckless. I mean, again, you wouldn't expect a con man to have any consideration of their actions. I mean, he was kind of cold and calculating in that process. So there's that kind of emotional cruelty, but there's clearly the very serious matter of him being in a position where potentially someone could have died because he could have made the wrong diagnosis or performed the wrong emergency operation.
I mean, to tell the parents of a child that they're going to live only to find out a short while later that that's just not true is treating people's emotions with such disdain. It's horrible.
After causing this devastation and heartache, Paul Bint was briefly held at a psychiatric hospital in Yorkshire, but once released in 1993, he headed to Lancashire, England, and walked into the Royal Preston Hospital, ready to continue his compulsive surgical scam.
In Preston General Hospital, he's offered to act as an anaesthetist with one case. So again, very serious, life-threatening decisions that he was making.
In the instance when I dealt with him at Royal Preston Hospital, which was actually on Boxing Day of 1993, he'd gone to Royal Preston Hospital and claimed he was a locum covering for the surgical registrar. He knows the layout of hospitals. He went to the telephonist room. He obtained the surgical registrar's pager and had all his calls diverted to himself. One of the great dangers with this was that the surgical registrar was on a major incident team, so if over that Christmas New Year period there'd been a major incident, obviously he wouldn't have been able to be contacted because Paul Bint had the pager.
When Paul Bint was playing the role of Dr. Bint, he would have been very deeply immersed in his fantasy life. And so actually the people who he was applying treatment to him would just be like extras in a TV production. And they would just be tools for him really to act out his fantasies. He probably didn't see them as real people at all.
I believe that his basic motive for entering hospitals was to steal. He would go in knowing that there were good pickings if he could get into the consultant surgeons' changing rooms near to the operating theatres, and then would steal wallets containing credit cards. And then he would use those credit cards to obtain money to live off for some time.
I view Paul Bint as a compensatory narcissist. So what that means is that the reality of himself is so inadequate that he wants to escape from that. So he retreats into a fantasy world. He'll be preoccupied with fantasies of himself as brilliant, as successful, as confident, and everything that he would wish to be.
But it's also got to be about control and about power, and potentially also always lead you to the women. By posing as a doctor, he often would meet people in that environment that he would then form relationships with.
A woman he was seeing in Preston, England, began to see through his white coat and stethoscope.
He spoke so often about his work at Royal Preston, his work as a doctor. It was basically his sole topic of conversation. And if they were out socially, he continually referred to the fact he was a doctor. Because he was in her company for a few weeks, she eventually thought that this just cannot be genuine. She was an intelligent girl, and her mother as well began to feel that there was something not right about Paul Bint.
The woman contacted the police and the truth unfolded. But even in custody, Paul Bint's lies kept coming.
On arrest, he'd given false details. He'd indicated he was Dr. David Watkin, whose details he'd obtained from a wallet he'd stolen from Leicester Royal Infirmary. He went through an interview claiming to be this person, and then we indicated near the end of the interview that we knew who he was from his fingerprint records, that we knew he was Paul Bint. and we knew his past record. He then wanted to be my best friend because he wanted bail, he wanted to get out again, and there was no realistic hope of him getting bail because it was obvious that he'd re-offend and he'd abscond.
Paul Bint was refused bail, and when he faced trial in October 1994, was once again sent to prison, this time for 5 years. However, Michael Tominey put into action a plan that was intended to prevent Paul Bint ever repeating his hospital scam in the future.
On his release in 1996, I arranged through the health service to have an early warning system when Paul was released from prison. I informed all the hospitals nationally, and we did a circulation to all police forces informing people that he was out and about. And I understand that that system still continues to this day.
But why does Paul Bint continue to revert to his surgical scam? When exploring his past, there are clues to help uncover and understand why Bint fixates upon and relentlessly targets hospitals in his cons.
His reason was that he says that when he was the age of 12, he went into hospital to have an appendix operation. He says because of his parents splitting up and because of a difficult family background, he says it was the first time that he'd experienced unconditional care and love and a kind of safe environment.
I think that is the point where the session started, and he seems to have made no secret of that by saying the incident of him having his appendix out, that was clearly a catalyst for his behaviour in the future.
It is possible that when Paul went to hospital and had his appendix out, that the treatment he received from hospital staff was the best treatment that he'd actually had as a child so far. So that's very sad, and that tells you where the roots of his fantasy life started. But of course that's not a whole explanation for his behaviour. His behaviour is complex and it's bizarre.
And it's probably wrong to try and explain a whole lifetime of pathological behaviour with one incident like that. But it does give us a clue, I think, as to his motivations, which is that he obviously associated being a doctor and being in that medical environment with a lot of things that were positive attributions for him. So he obviously felt kind of happy and safe and cared for in that hospital environment. And then later on, by posing as doctor, he could presumably get all those things you get when you put on a white coat: respect, admiration, people listening to you, people paying attention to you. So you can see how that would drive him.
For reasons of escape and control, I think from a very early age he pretended to be other people and found that that was a way of wiping those kind of problems clean.
And so by claiming that he was actually helping people, he's trying to justify his own actions in a pretty feeble way, but you know, his psychology in that sense is pretty feeble, so he's able to convince himself.
I mean, one of his former girlfriends said to me that the thing about Paul Bint is he's never come to terms with his own ordinariness.
By 1996, Paul Bint was once again out of prison, and his compulsion to live out his conman fantasies was stronger than ever. This time, the serial confidence trickster had a new destination and target in mind. He was heading north, to Scotland.
And I looked out and he was gone and the car was gone. Because I thought, that's a bit odd, because I still had the car keys.
Since the early 80s, Paul Bint has spent time in and out of prison. Over 25 years, he has made a career of adopting aliases to dupe the public on an eclectic and extraordinary collection of levels. But his primary focus has always been infiltrating hospitals and posing as doctors, administering dangerous, life-threatening treatments and stealing from the staff and patients.
By putting on that identity, maybe in his own twisted psychology, he was somehow short-cutting straight to all those attributes that he valued so much, you know, respect, status, without actually having to work for it.
After serving time for the northwest of England surgical scam, it wasn't long before Paul Bint once again set to work conning. And his legacy of cons are not always of the medical variety. By 2000, Paul Bint was in court after tricking rail chiefs into putting him up in a luxury hotel in Edinburgh, Scotland, after posing as Lachlan Campbell Brereton, the QC involved in the Lockerbie bombing trial. and this would not be the last time he would pose as an esteemed lawyer. However, upon release, Paul Bint returned to Scotland and the cons continued. In 2001, he was passing himself off as a millionaire property magnate. Bint, under another alias, made an appointment at a luxury car dealership and appeared to be in the market to acquire a sporty number.
He introduced himself as Paul Blenheim. He says he was a property agent or a property dealer. He was actually in Glasgow that day looking at a nightclub in the city centre that was for sale, and he'd actually seen the cars advertised here, so he'd made a phone call to us.
He was masquerading as a wealthy millionaire, not a famous named person, but somebody with a great deal of money, and he had the air to carry it off, and indeed the expensive clothes.
Well, he was very well dressed, and his mannerism was like well educated, well spoken, sort of English spoken, just like an educated businessman.
His MO, his modus operandi, is to first of all look the part. So he'd have on his £3,000 Versace suit, which obviously turns out to be a jumble sale suit. He'd carry a copy of the FT. He'd have a state-of-the-art mobile phone, an organiser, and BlackBerry or whatever. He said that he was. You shouldn't really laugh, I guess, although there is a kind of comical side to it. He said he owned a hotel in Mauritius, I think, a nightclub in London. He had property in Edinburgh and London. And on the face of it, I guess he looked like a kind of cast-iron prospect. You imagine the kind of pound signs registering in the salesman's eyes.
He says he was in the market for a very expensive sports car, so he looked at a few and he asked if we could take a test drive in the Ferrari.
He would drop into the conversation various information that he gathered about the cars, because, I mean, it's true that he has driven a number of Porsches and Bentleys and Aston Martins in the past, so he has actually got some experience of driving, obviously not at all in a legal way, mostly through having stolen them.
Conmen quite often use elements of truth in their lies because it's so much easier to make yourself believe that you're telling the truth if some of what you're saying is actually the truth.
So we took him a test drive in the Ferrari. It was maybe just a wee bit too sporty, noisy for him, so he decided to suit his image. He would go for the Aston Martin because it was more, as you would say, a sort of gentleman's sports car. Normally a customer wants to drive a car to see the like and feel of it, so because I drove a Ferrari, I just took him out and just let him drive the Aston Martin and I was in the passenger seat. Then he decided basically he was going to buy the car, made a few phone calls, organised with his bank to pick up a bank draft.
With everything appearing above board, Ross Campbell and his customer, Mr. Blenheim, aka Paul Bint, had time to kill until the banker's draft would be cleared and the sale completed.
So we stopped for lunch. So I says, well, this pub here is just opened, we'll go in there. And he parked the car. I took the key and locked the car. Then went into the pub. Right away he was using his phone, so I ordered up a couple of drinks and sandwiches, and he says, I'm just going to pop out to use my phone.
They thought he'd popped out for a moment to make a phone call. He in fact popped out and stole the car. And off he went, filled it up with petrol and didn't even pay for that.
The drinks arrived, the sandwiches arrived, so I thought, I'll just see where he is, give him a shout. And I looked out and he was gone and the car was gone. Which I thought, that's a bit odd because I still had the car keys.
Conned and carless. It had all been lies. There was no bank draft and now there was no car. Unbeknownst to Ross Campbell, Bint had surreptitiously pocketed the spare keys to the Aston Martin back at the showroom when he was viewing the car's service history file. He had struck again. All Ross Campbell could do was wait and see if the £55,000 sports car would ever be seen again.
The Aston Martin was recovered 4 days later. It had 900 miles on the clock. I think he'd used it to drive around various girlfriends that he was duping at the time. And he'd managed to do £15,000 worth of damage.
Then when the CID came to interview me, then they basically took a description, showed me photographs, then told me basically this chap is a con man, he's got a lot of convictions, he's one of Britain's most wanted con men.
In a developing pattern, the police again caught up with Bint and he found himself back behind bars. But on his release from prison in 2002, Paul Bint lost little time in getting started on his next scam, a scam that shrewdly drew together many of the key elements of his past crimes, creating his most comprehensive con yet.
He was released on the 11th of December. He's in London by the 12th of December. And he's certainly a man who just cannot stop.
People who are compulsive liars are very difficult to treat. Psychologists say that, quite often they think they're normal. It's everyone else that's not quite right.
And once again, hospitals were on the agenda. Although this time he wasn't masquerading as a doctor, this time he was a patient. Like in 2000, Paul Bint was once again presenting himself as a high-profile British barrister. This time he was claiming to be Orlando Pownall QC.
He was impersonating Orlando Pownall, Queen's Counsel, who is an eminent lawyer, a name probably well known to a number of people. He had prosecuted the case involving the murder of Jill Dando, the defendant Barry George. He was also involved around the time in a high-profile murder case of Danielle Jones, which was up in Chelmsford.
Someone like Orlando Pownall, the QC in the Jill Dando murder trial, would have been in the public eye at the time this was going on. He'd been in the papers and Paul Bint would have seen his name and seen him as a character that people were reading about. And that's probably why he picked up on his identity and used it.
Released from prison in Scotland just 2 days earlier, Paul Bint had a new alias, and with the new identity came a convincing and inspired backstory to execute his most ambitious scam yet.
What he did do was arrive in London with no money, as far as we're aware, and nowhere to stay. And so he did attend local hospitals, 3 in total. He gave the same story at all 3, that he was Orlando Pownall QC. He had crashed his Aston Martin. He believed that he had received internal injuries. He was in pain, and he then submitted himself to certain hospital tests, although he did indicate he was allergic to iodine, which I understand meant that certain tests couldn't be carried out. Of the tests that were carried out, in his urine was a concerning amount of blood, sufficient for the doctors to want to keep him in for observation for some time. And I have no doubt that that blood was put in by him. He had not been in a car accident. He had got off the train.
Like many of Bint's audacious cons of the past, this continued to feed his ego and his bizarre fantasy life.
Well, he would give a medical history, and he just can't resist adding exciting bits. And part of the medical history on one of his notes, or one of his sets of hospital notes that I saw, was that he indicated that he had some shrapnel as a result of being involved in the Hyde Park bombings. Simply part of his medical history, but something of... nothing's ever straightforward with him at all.
Someone who becomes a Walter Mitty-type character actually takes on the persona of that character and almost completely believes themselves to be that person.
And this con combined elements of his most notorious scams.
He has a love of fast cars, none of which ever belonged to him legitimately, but it's something that certainly he had stolen when he was masquerading as a millionaire up in Scotland. The irony is that he comes down to London and professes to have crashed one and uses that in his scam right from the outset.
The fact that he'd actually been arrested for stealing an Aston Martin, using that in the story when he pretended to be Orlando Pownall, allowed him to create a much more effective and plausible lie, because some of it was in fact true. He'd been in an Aston Martin.
The trappings like the Aston Martin or a smart suit, they are absolutely essential to cons, particularly the type of con that he was trying to pull. And in con parlance, that's called putting on the dog, which is basically where you act the part. And that's based on some very important victim psychology. So if you're trying to pretend to be rich, for instance, but you don't look rich, you don't look wealthy, you don't look sophisticated, then the people you're trying to hobnob with will automatically suspect you, and they'll have an instant barrier of mistrust. But that works against them because they think they're protected against people who are trying to rip them off, for instance, because they think they can spot those people. But they automatically are more likely to accept people that seem like them, that seem well-to-do, that have a convincing air about them.
Clearly it wasn't enough for him just to sort of try and pretend to be these people. He needed those extra trappings, the fast cars and the girlfriends and the nice houses. He needed all that other stuff as well to bolster his feeling of being powerful.
There is some continuity between his stories in that he may adapt a theme and continue it. Certainly in this case, it was interrupted by some years in prison between the two incidences.
Straight out of prison, Paul Bint had found a unique way to cope with the fact he didn't have a bed of his own to sleep in, and that bed ensured he had constant care and attention.
Well, in the hospital, he's taking a bed away from another patient, but he has a roof over his head, a nice warm roof over the Christmas period. He has dinner, bed and breakfast, and he has some bodies, as far as the nurses and doctors are concerned, who in effect cater to his every need.
Con artists, a lot of what drives them is they do get a thrill out of proving to themselves somehow that they're a cut above the common herd, and that they're a step ahead, and that they're, you know, that they put one over on you. And I suspect that Paul Bint probably did get a big thrill out of that, and that's probably part of what motivates him, because I think it's part of what motivates a lot of con artists. So it's all about having put one over on someone and proving that you are smarter and faster and better than they are.
Settled into University College Hospital, London, England, Paul Bint knew his scam had a shelf life. So, from his sick bed, he spotted a female doctor who was to become his next unsuspecting victim. His charm offensive began, and she believed his lies. He was Orlando Pownall, QC.
They met and exchanged numbers, so I understand, whilst on hospital premises, but she didn't and wasn't involved in his treatment at all. And contact was made by him after he had left the hospital. And as I understand it, they met up, and he indicated that there was a problem with his accommodation. He said his father lived in Millionaire's Row, and but for some reason he couldn't stay there, and he persuaded her to use a room, which is what he did, just used a room in her house for a short period of time, but that gave him access to her belongings, her money, and such like.
And Bint took advantage of her generosity.
He took the laptop, computer, he took cheques, he took money, both from her purse and indeed by apparently borrowing it and of course never returning it, and more than one credit card, all of which were used to buy, in the main, extremely expensive suits. He would fully clothe himself in top designer wear.
But it wasn't long before she became suspicious.
They went to a party and he didn't even have any money on him. He'd have forgotten his wallet, and so he'd asked just to borrow some money from her, and it became increasingly apparent over those, and it was a very few days, that this was a man who said a lot but did very little. And she also caught him going through items of hers at home and became increasingly suspicious about that, and that resulted in her finally asking him to leave on Christmas Eve.
It was shortly after she had asked him to leave that the trusting female doctor heard some spine-chilling news, that Orlando Pownall, QC, was actually on holiday in Barbados with his family, and the man she had been sharing her home with was in fact an imposter. She immediately called the police.
Orlando Pownall, Queen's Counsel, was not in the country at the time. In fact, he was overseas on holiday with his family. So once that was discovered, the police were notified, and the police, within an incredibly short period of time, linked it immediately to being Mr. Bint.
Once more, the hunt for Paul Bint, King Con, was on. Paul Bint has been working as a con man for over 25 years, adopting many aliases. There is a recurring theme in Bint's con man career, Whether posing as a doctor or a patient, he seems obsessed with hospitals. But are his actions those of an opportunist conman, someone who is clinically ill, or is he suffering from some sort of psychological disorder, such as Munchausen syndrome, whereby the subject tries to get attention by feigning illness? In Bint's case, experts believe his motivations are much more complicated.
Part of the psychology of Munchausen syndrome sufferers is that they're really seeking attention, and they're willing to go through painful or invasive medical procedures if it means they can be the centre of attention. And you can see the same psychology at work in Bint's case, in that he relished the attention.
Munchausen syndrome is a label that you could apply to Paul Bint. This is when people contrive symptoms of physical illness so that they can receive care and attention. But also, Paul was willing to play the role of doctor, not just the role of patient. So it seems to me that the important thing is access to this environment where he can play out his fantasies. And so I would think that maybe a label that's best applied to him would be narcissist. Narcissists are people who are very preoccupied with fantasies of themselves as somebody who's special, who has power and importance and status and receives special attention.
In 2002, 2 weeks after being released from prison in Scotland for stealing an Aston Martin, Bint was touring hospitals in London, England. This time as a patient instead of a doctor. He was posing as eminent QC Orlando Pownall, claiming he had crashed his fictitious Aston Martin and now had internal injuries. After successfully using the scam to get free bed and board at University College Hospital, London, England, Paul Bint conned a female doctor into letting him stay with her. After she discovered he'd been stealing from her, she asked him to leave. She then discovered he was not who he claimed to be, and she told the police. Unaware the police were again hunting for him, Paul Bint was once again homeless and pulled his scam again. This time audaciously turning up at Hemel Hempstead Hospital near London by ambulance.
Christmas Eve, he's homeless again, and he attends another hospital at Hemel Hempstead. He, as I recall, arrived by ambulance on that particular occasion, so how he did that I don't know. But once he arrived, it was the same story. Eminent QC, Aston Martin, internal injuries, blood in the urine.
Oblivious that the police had been alerted to his crimes and were looking for him, Paul Bint continued to go about his business, using hospitals as his hunting ground.
Money went missing from patients. The gentleman in the bed next to him lost some money. So did Mr. Bint. Mr. Bint lost, I think, 3 or 4 times the amount of money, apparently. Mr. Bint blamed the staff in the hospital, so money was clearly obtained. And the gentleman in the bed next door, his daughter, was taken in by Mr. Bint.
If someone really targets you and gets to know you very well and manipulates you to a large degree, and you're a basically trustful person, it's very difficult not to be conned.
Paul Bint was discharged from Hemel Hempstead near London, England, but with nowhere to stay, headed to a third hospital with exactly the same story.
When he was released from that hospital, he went to the Whittington Hospital and did the same story again. And he stayed in the Whittington Hospital up until New Year's Eve. Whilst he's there, and this is one of the not-so-nice sides of Mr. Bint's character, he steals a credit card from a man who was dying, who is now dead, Mr. Lewis, in the adjoining bed, and uses that to wine and dine the female that he met in the second hospital.
He's reasonably good looking, although you look closely, he kind of dyes his hair, and he's certainly not as young as he claims that he is. But, if he comes in the flash suit and he's often got a wallet full of money. I think when I was spending time with him in Edinburgh, he was carrying around £2,000 worth of cash. So perhaps superficially, you can see why it might fool some people. It might look the kind of part, and you might believe who he is, and you might think, well, here's an interesting individual with lots of money who can show me a good time.
You're also taking advantage of what in psychology is called the halo effect, which is if you come across well because you're good looking or because you're charming or personable or whatever, you're more likely to be attributed with characteristics that you don't have, such as trustworthiness or intelligence.
He preys on certain people, either by flattery or by taking advantage of them. For example, with the woman that he took away for the night, with a stolen credit card. Her father had been admitted to hospital after a serious emergency on Christmas Eve, and she clearly was not herself when she met this man who was larger than life.
You could look at it that he gets a certain amount of financial, sexual and kind of status validation from doing it. I mean, by pretending to be a leading barrister or a ballet dancer or whoever, he clearly enjoys the way people respond to that.
Money isn't always the only motive. I think sometimes it's the emotional bolstering to feel important and clever and to be admired by others that is often the payback for these lies.
On the 2nd of January, just over 3 weeks after his release from prison and a hat-trick of hospitals later, the police once again caught up with Paul Bint by playing on one of his key weaknesses: women. While in hospital, Bint had pursued a woman who had spurned his advances, but she agreed to help the police and arranged a date with the conman. Only their romantic evening would be gate-crashed by the constabulary.
As I understand it, it was arranged that one of the women who he had been trying to take out, who had refused him, in fact contacted him, and she encouraged the future meeting which the police attended when he was arrested.
Paul Bint as a conman is actually not that effective. He's been caught almost every time he's done anything to try and get money or property. What he's successfully achieved is to create personas for himself, to give himself moments in time where he can be respected and loved by other people. So he's a fantasist, and in that respect he's been successful. But as a con man, he's a bit of a disaster.
In October 2003, Paul Bint pleaded guilty to charges including theft and attaining properties by deception. The judge said to Bint, "You have caused anguish, embarrassment, loss, and difficulty to your victims." The judge also said a psychiatric report had concluded that Bint suffered from a currently untreatable psychopathic disorder, and so his case would not be dealt with under the Mental Health Act. Paul Bint was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months in prison.
Paul Bint has obviously created something like 25 different aliases, different personas of his own personality, and it is... You have to wonder whether he still knows who Paul Bint and whether Paul Bint exists today, or is still that little boy in the hospital bed having his appendix out.
Paul Bint's conman career creates a fascinating case file, not simply because of the audacity and perseverance he has exhibited, but because of the way he seems to thrive on his notoriety. Unlike other conmen who by definition attempt to live anonymously, Bint has courted the press and even been interviewed by glossy magazines.
I'm sure Paul Bint does enjoy people writing about him and the attention that he gets from being a con artist. People tend to view con artists as chancers, as rogues, rather than actually the criminals that they are. And so this would probably be quite an attractive identity for a man who has a very fragile sense of himself.
In the kind of the colourful annals of British criminal history, he certainly stands out. He was dubbed by the police at one time King Con, and because the tabloids have written about him as Britain's cruelest con man.
Paul Bint has committed over 100 offences, appeared in court over 20 times, and spent almost a decade of his 25-year conman career in custody. Now released, there are fears Paul Bint will never stop.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if Paul Bint re-offended on release.
The way that he's unable to go straight, if you like, for even a day is quite telling, but con artists often find it hard to go straight because they're just not used to doing anything else. What could Paul Bint have done for a real job? Would he have been equipped for a normal life? He probably felt not.
I personally don't think he will have learnt anything. I don't think he'll even have learnt from his mistakes. I think he'll do it again, and I think he'll be caught again.
As much as you might think he's the lovable rogue, as much as there's been some humorous things written about him being this Walter Mitty character, there's a very dangerous and sinister side to him, and the safest place for Paul Bint, quite frankly, is in jail.
In this show, the story of Michael Hammond, a conman for the fame-obsessed millennium, who lied, cheated, defrauded and terrorised celebrities, royals and anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path in order to make money and feed his unquenchable desire for power, fame and notoriety.
I would describe Michael Hammond as your narcissistic conman.
Hammond was one of the biggest liars that I have encountered in 25 years of criminal law.
This is somebody who's not necessarily conning for profit. He's got a much deeper need.
With a callous disregard for the lives he damaged and put at risk, Michael Hammond is a man who lived a double life and seemingly would do anything to feel important and powerful.
I described him as being wicked and evil.
He's driven by his own ego.
I've seen him twist people's heads completely.
Michael Edward Hammond was born in East Sussex in December 1968. An only child born into a working-class family, his upbringing was unspectacular.
He was a decorator's son from Bexhill-on-Sea. There were early instances of sort of juvenile shoplifting and so on.
Hammond's criminal behaviour was relentless in his youth. It saw him expelled from school and, aged 18, Hammond first experimented with the persona that would become his addiction and ultimate downfall: impersonating a police officer. In 1987, Hammond called the police claiming to be a CID officer in order to obtain an ex-directory telephone number. His lies were exposed and he was arrested, fined and given community service. A month later, Hammond was in court again, facing 74 charges to his name, with a further 30 offences taken into consideration. The obscene number of charges included fraud and theft, but even a custodial sentence was not a wake-up call for Hammond. When released in 1989, his criminal career continued to disturbingly flourish when he forged documents to illegally obtain a Porsche.
His early scams is he managed to get hold of a Porsche, and he did this by swiping a sheet of paper with a letterhead on it from someone's office.
Hammond used the headed paper to forge a document saying he was a director and trustee of a company. Using the fake name, the letter was used to open a bank account with a £10,000 overdraft. And with that overdraft, he bought his Porsche.
It's amazing what you can get away with, basically, with a fake heading on a piece of paper.
Michael Edward Hammond had graduated from his illicit youth and was now a fully fledged criminal. But his relentless and contemptible behaviour was married to a bizarre personal aspiration to appear important and of a high social standing, even though he had an unquenchable and immoral compulsion to break the law.
For some reason, he always felt very ashamed of his background. I think that was a factor in his decision to take his name and make it into a double-barreled name. But that, strangely enough, is symptomatic of a lot of con men. There was a man named Guy de Montfort who gave himself that rather grand name, but he was in fact Graham Lever, born in Dartford in Kent. Again, a humble background. A humble background always seems to be a factor in these things, a strange desire to be something more important than they feel that they are.
I think that Michael Hammond is definitely a narcissist. A narcissist is somebody who has fantasies which they're preoccupied with of themselves as being famous or special, somehow superior and better than other people. They tend to be incredibly arrogant, but they can also be very engaging and they can be quite high achievers.
His actual name is Michael Hammond. His middle name is Edward, so his name is in fact Michael Edward Hammond, but he simply added an S to the Edwards and made it into a double-barreled name, presumably because he thought it was posh.
It's not always about making your bank balance bigger. It's about the power and the control and having that sort of fantasy lifestyle that a lot of people, do want. But he went about it in obviously a very different way.
Hammond was obsessed with the celebrity world and desperately wanted to be part of it. And his conman charm helped, blagging his way into London's celebrity party scene. No one who met him at these glamorous events could have possibly imagined the sinister dark side the unpredictable conman was hiding. In reality, Hammond was a failed businessman and sometime estate agent, in severe debt, with a prolific criminal record, who funded his life with freelance consultancy work. But he was convincingly selling himself to the London glitterati as a millionaire playboy, a film producer and TV hotshot.
Michael had a vision of where he wanted to get to in life, and he used the celebrity circuit to try and achieve that.
I think when you're at a party and there are lots of famous people there, when you go up to the famous person and say, hi, how lovely to see you, the famous person tends to assume maybe they have met you at some point, but sort of doesn't want to make a scene and says, yeah, sure, how lovely to see you, and maybe agrees to be photographed with you and will exchange small talk with you. They're very vulnerable, these famous people.
Hammond exploited this vulnerability in 2001 when he hustled his way into the National Television Awards. Hammond targeted Coronation Street newcomer Scott Wright, whose star was on the ascent, and had no idea he was dealing with an accomplished criminal and con man.
I was nominated for an award for the most popular newcomer, and I was wandering around feeling a bit kind of starstruck by the whole thing. And out of the crowd, this guy came up and went, "Scotty!" And I went, "Right." And he went, "I've not seen you for ages, mate, not seen you since we did that thing on Sky." And I went, "Right." And I'm very polite, me anyway, so I just shook his hand and I said hello. "Can I get you a drink?" I said, "Yes." We got a drink and he had some girls with him, which was all good. And then he had a Range Rover waiting outside with a driver in it, which was also quite impressive. And I thought, well, you know what? I might as well go with him and the chicks. And and we did that. And so that's basically how I met him. And you know what? Obviously now, knowing what I know, he'd never met me before in his life. He'd probably just seen me up on the screen when I got my nomination.
Someone's being very friendly to you, they seem to know you. You're a bit concerned that you actually might have met them before, just don't remember, and you don't want to be rude. And by that means, he can actually gain your trust very quickly and manipulate people.
Despite his double life balancing criminality with celebrity, Michael Edwards Hammond was on a one-man mission to move in the same circles as the world's most famous faces.
He would somehow be able to get us into absolutely every party, into the VIP bits in these inner sanctums of nightclubs, talking to all these people, to meet Britney Spears and to meet Tom Cruise and everything. And I don't know how he did it, just the gab, just the gift of the gab probably.
Hammond seems to be the sort of chap who's obviously very articulate, very friendly, very easy to get on with, obviously has the gift of the gab, is able to sort of engage in conversation with anybody, you know, whereas some of us would meet perhaps a personality and be a little bit reticent about talking to them and engaging them in conversation. He doesn't seem to have any qualms about that.
I mean, he was actually photographed with Elton John, although I did speak to David Furnish about this subsequently, and Elton John had no recollection of ever having met this man.
One of my favourite A-list stars that I got to meet at these premieres was Tom Hanks, and he seemed like he is a very nice guy, and he came up to me and he went, "Like your shirt," and I went, "Like your career, do you want to swap?" And he found that really funny. But I guess I probably wouldn't have got so close to someone like that to talk to if it wasn't for him blagging everything.
And I think the fact that he was able to shake hands and rub shoulders with Tom Hanks, Robin Williams, Steven Spielberg, Hugh Hefner, the head of the biggest talent agency in Hollywood, demonstrated that Michael had a way of convincing people he was telling the truth and legitimate. And he had a very good skill at that.
And of course, if you mingle in those circles, you probably do actually get to meet people, so it's even hard to separate fact from fantasy. And I think we can be pretty sure that in his own mind, there was no separation. He probably lived in a complete fantasy world and was completely unable to distinguish between them.
Michael Hammond is a con man for the millennium. His aim was not simply the typical hunt for money, but a hunger for fame and attention.
We are in a period where celebrity is all important. You are nobody unless you are in the papers.
He is obsessed with that celebrity culture. He just wants that instant fix.
This creation of Michael Hammond's was all about making himself feel important, and being a celebrity these days is the way to be important.
Michael Hammond was playing the fame game, and in true con man style, cheating. He knew that if he was going to scam his way into celebrity, then he would have to have Fleet Street on his side.
He seems to have reached a period where he's obviously been mixing with some celebrities and decides to take it a step further by actually approaching newspapers and magazines with stories to raise his own profile.
His great skill was often, cultivating journalists and calling newspapers, particularly when he felt he had a big interview to give.
Well, we think of a con man and we think of somebody who is motivated by money, but there's usually another motive, there's usually an emotional need that's being met. Now, for Michael Hammond, his need is to be looked at, his need is to be given some attention, and his need is to be seen as somebody who is special. So that's what's motivating him, not money, but importance, actually some sort of validation for himself as a human being.
Celebrity was one of Hammond's obsessions, and he used it to feed his addiction to appear important and obtain attention. From the moment he infiltrated the showbiz set, Hammond ensured he achieved his twisted aims by selling bogus kiss-and-tell stories to the press to raise his profile. His first victim was PR girl Caroline Stanbury, who had been romantically linked to Prince Andrew in the press. And it was being reported that the prince had stolen Caroline from Michael Hammond. Naturally, Hammond had made the whole thing up and gone to the papers with his lies.
With Caroline Stanbury, the moment it started to be reported that Prince Andrew was going out with her, he phones up a newspaper which ran a long interview with him in which he was described, as he often was in the early days, as a millionaire businessman. And in this interview he talked about how he introduced Prince Andrew to her and that he was the beginning of the romance, and basically he was the important figure and everything, and that he was very laid back about the fact Prince Andrew was going out with the woman that he regarded as his. And although she denies vigorously that she had anything much to do with him, I think she probably knew him, but I don't think it was anything more than that.
And Caroline Stanbury is not the only high-profile woman Michael Hammond lied about having a relationship with, and sold bogus stories to the tabloids about romantic liaisons he never had.
I've heard Danny Minogue, Jordan, I've heard Renee Zellweger, and a lot of other women.
I'd like it on record that I've never slept with Michael Hammond. Now, actually, I don't think he would ever claim to have slept with me because I'm not famous. I'm not Danny Minogue, I'm not Jordan. He maybe hopes that he'd slept with or had relationships with these women. But actually, it was a really good way of getting some attention because the Sunday newspapers took him up on this story with actually very little evidence. They advertised to the world that he was claiming to have had these relationships. In actual fact, they'd never heard of him, probably.
They all tell me that they've not slept with him. And I suppose the writing was on the wall about how he operated and the person he was when he used to show me scrapbooks of all his press clippings.
Ex-Coronation Street actor Scott Wright had started spending time with Michael Hammond when he visited London, and on one occasion Hammond was very keen for Scott to see his conquests in print at his Docklands flat. Michael Hammond kept all his press cuttings and kiss-and-tell articles in a scrapbook.
It's all about celebrity with Michael, and it's all about that, and that's my first impression of when I went in his flat. It was just plastered with pictures of him with famous people. And I think the scrapbook, the scrapbook was just insane, completely insane.
Another person who spent time with Michael Hammond was celebrity manager Jonathan Shalit. Jonathan met Hammond on the showbiz scene and they briefly became acquaintances. On one occasion, Jonathan lunched with Hammond at the famous Ivy restaurant in London. They were joined by a top Hollywood agent and Tara Palmer-Tompkinson.
I've met Tara a number of times, who's a very lovely girl and a very sensible girl. And it was quite clear from the relationship between Tara and the top Hollywood agent and Michael that there was a degree of friendship. As I found out later, he probably wasn't as close to them as I might have thought he was, but he would certainly appear close. But in fact, it worked the other way, because I think Tara probably thought I was closer to Michael than I was as well. And at the end of the meal, Tara had to leave, and Michael, as a gentleman or representing himself as a gentleman, saw Tara to the door. And as he was walking out the door of the restaurant and onto the street, he had his arm over her shoulder, putting her coat on, and there were like a ton of paparazzi there. Now, at the Ivy at lunchtime, they're not a ton of paparazzi unless they're invited. Now, I don't know who tipped the paparazzi off that day. All I know is Michael Hammond walked Tara to the door as the door opened, so at the very moment when Tara walked onto the street, Michael had his arm round Tara's shoulder, which is a shot a lot of the paparazzi got. And of course, a few hours later, the picture desk at newspapers were getting lots of calls in from an anonymous person saying Tara was at the Ivy with her new boyfriend at lunchtime, and the picture they had was Tara and Michael Hammond, so read into that what you may.
And then there was Renee Zellweger. Read into this what you may.
He rang me up from LA and said, me and Renee are settling down together, it's all going so well, it's brilliant, read the newspaper. So I got the Sunday Sport, because it was usually in one of them, because they're the only ones who'd take it. Then it managed to filter through to some of the other less salubrious newspapers, and it was him with his arm around Renee Zellweger saying they were happy and they were getting married or kissing her and blah blah blah.
Normally his technique is simply to leave parties just at the very time that they're leaving. And apparently this is what happened with Zellweger. And then it makes it look like he is actually going out with them. And then, of course, classically, he'll phone up a newspaper and tell a story to them.
Someone who was with him at the time had just told me he just legged it over, give her a kiss, and then sold the story to the paper. Brilliant. Genius.
Michael Hammond was making small amounts of money from selling stories claiming to have slept with famous women, a claim the women in question vehemently deny. Hammond's lies and stories may have fooled the celebrity circuit completely, but as Scott Wright spent more time with Hammond, the facade of the fun-loving party guy slipped, and he witnessed the con man's darker side firsthand.
Obviously, I didn't really ever get to know him because he was telling so many white lies or whatever. But there was a time when a taxi driver pulled out in front of him. He was in this Range Rover, and he pulled up. He flew out of the car, smacked his fist on the windscreen, told him he was going to rip his head off. The taxi driver shut all the doors and then get back in the car and nearly drove the Range Rover over the cab. He never showed a side of aggression towards me. I know he did it to one of our mates once. One of my mates had said something to him and he phoned him up and threatened him. And he's not a big guy, Michael, but he never did anything to me.
The disturbing incidents Scott Wright witnessed were only a hint of the violence and cruelty Hammond was capable of. In 1998, Hammond impersonated a police officer for a second known time. He shockingly pretended to be a special branch police officer and attempted to con a lorry driver out of money when they had a road accident. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. It would not be the last time he adopted the persona of a policeman. It was to become his obsession. However, when released, Hammond's criminal behaviour was his basest yet. He was arrested for ABH after attacking a woman over a parking space.
It's very easy to see Hammond as some sort of frivolous clown who sort of wanders into celebrity parties, doesn't seem to be doing anybody any harm, bit of a Jack the Lad, and you can always sit back and actually laugh at these celebrities who've been perhaps duped or taken in by him. But there certainly seems to be a sort of dark side to him. He does have a temper, and he's not afraid of lashing out in a very severe way.
Narcissists do tend to just fly off into uncontrollable rages, and I think that the car park incident is quite revealing to me. Here was a case where Hammond was simply asked to move his car, but to him, that was probably a great affront. Don't you know who I am? How dare you suggest that you're more important than me and that I should move my car for you? And clearly, that affront to his ego and his identity sent him off into a rage. He ended up having a violent confrontation over a car parking space.
Hammond was sentenced to 120 hours community service and fined £866 for his brutal attack. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. The career con man had an astounding 102 criminal convictions to his name by the time he was 30, including 48 charges of fraud and 17 charges of theft. None of Hammond's celebrity friends could have known or could have predicted the new depths his criminal career would descend into in the years to come. Michael Hammond had successfully scammed his way onto the red carpet, the red tops, and rubbed shoulders with Hollywood royalty. His conman chicken and egg approach to fame paid off briefly in 2002 when he had a one-off job as a celebrity gossip presenter for one of the Sky Sports channels. Hammond filmed at Windsor Castle, a location that would later become intertwined with his notoriety and infamy. Hammond managed to keep his 102 criminal convictions clandestine, and those in Hammond's circle were further convinced of his legitimacy when he conned them into the company of the royal family.
There was an incident after I'd known him for a year, and he rang me up and he said, come down to Watford, we're going to go on a polo field with Prince Charles and his sons. And I went, right, whatever. But I was coming to London anyway, so I did. I jumped on the train, I got off at Watford, he had a driver to meet us. It was all very good, he was all dressed smart in suits and everything. Went to the field, and there they were. And I was like, whoa, wow. That's quite interesting. And so I got introduced to Prince Charles, and he acted like he knew Prince Charles, like they were best mates. I didn't detect that Prince Charles knew him. But the most interesting part was when he said, let's go and say hello to my mate Wills. And I went, you don't know Prince, come on mate, you bullshit me, you don't know him. And he wandered straight up to me and he went, Wills, how them fillies doing up in St Andrews? Are you pulling any? How's it all going? I've not seen you since, was it Katrina? Katrina's your bird, wasn't it? And I stood there and looked at Prince William's face, and he had never met him before in his life. And then he went over and talked to Prince Harry, who he'd probably never met before either, and left me with William, who obviously didn't want to talk to me. And so I think the majority of people, he thought, he told me that he knew he'd probably never met before in his life.
But in 2002, after a one-off presenting job, Michael Hammond got a lucky break, and with that, the chance to go straight. He had been offered a presenting job as the Hollywood correspondent on Granada's flagship daytime TV show for ITV1, This Morning. With alleged knowledge of his criminal background dating back to his youth, including charges of ABH, theft and impersonating a police officer, Granada Television still offered Hammond the chance to become famous in his own right. And with that, the opportunity to put his criminal behaviour firmly in the past. A decision they would later come to bitterly regret.
And he'd convinced Granada to give him an opportunity to go out to Hollywood. And I said, well, do Granada know about your background? And Michael said yes. And indeed, when the legal affairs person at Granada called me, he confirmed he knew about Michael's background. They wanted to give Michael another chance and they believed in him.
Now, at this point, I would have gone, right, I've blagged everyone for ages, I've got away with it for this far, now I've finally got a job, which might be befitting an aspect of my talents, but oh no, he couldn't let it lie, he had to go one step further.
I'm in the south of France a week later on holiday, lying on my lilo in the pool. The phone goes and I get a call from the head of legal affairs at Granada Television saying to me, did I know anything about Michael and Air France and fraudulent activity, because Granada were possibly going to be sued by Air France, to which I said, no.
With the ink still wet on Hammond's contract, he began fraudulently using his new job as a tool to scam and boost his ever-hungry ego. He forged a letter from Air France management stating that he and his companions had been upgraded to first class for their flight out to LA to begin his new career. The con worked for the first leg of the flight, but in Paris staff became suspicious and exposed the web of lies, and word soon got back to his new bosses at Granada Television. Hammond's need to scam had ruined his career before it had even got off the ground.
By the time they got to Paris to change over to the LA part of the flight, Air France had sussed that it wasn't a legit letter from the head of Air France, and there was a massive kind of furore and arguments and shouting. And to cut a long story short, when they got to Los Angeles, the relationship between Michael and the Granada team went from bad to worse, and Granada at that point pulled out, realising that they couldn't deal with Michael Hammond.
He'd blagged his way into it, he got it all teed up and blown it big time.
You'd have thought it'd be stupid to ruin this nice little learning that you've got set up, but that's classic conman psychology, to not think about consequences.
Michael Hammond is a con man, hungry for fame, power and attention.
He is a genuine fantasist. He genuinely believes, while he's playing these parts, that they're true.
The stupidity of Michael Hammond was that he actually has caused his own downfall by an inability to know what right or wrong was.
You do have to wonder though, you know, if he'd just been a little bit more tempered, if his ego hadn't have been so hungry and needed feeding so constantly, just what he could have gone on to achieve.
After personally wrecking the career opportunity of a lifetime as a TV presenter by fraudulently trying to upgrade a flight, Hammond returned to the UK and carried on crashing celebrity premieres and parties. But he also went on to change tack, adopting a whole host of different but telling personas.
In terms of the roles that he gives himself in life, they're always authority figures. They're always policemen, surgeons, film producers. I think an awful lot of these roles too have been hit upon in order to hit upon women, perhaps.
And in 2004, Hammond adopted the audacious role of a bogus doctor, compulsively calling the police 5 times when he was stuck in heavy London traffic.
He was in a car, very heavy traffic, centre of London. Normal people would just sit there and bear it, but of course being him, he had to do something dramatic. I don't know whether he had a glamorous girl in the car with him that he wanted to impress, but what does he do? He phones up the police, says he is a surgeon on the way to perform a major life-saving operation for a young girl suffering from a terrible illness.
On this particular occasion, the police facilitated his passage through traffic from, I think it was Bywood Street in East London to St Thomas's Hospital.
This was just purely so he could travel through London and have other people look at him, you know, with the lights blaring and the sirens going, and think, my, he must be a really important character.
And you don't get much more power mad than that. And in fact, he tries this on several occasions, and he even has the audacity the next day to ring up and thank them for their help. Using figures like doctors, surgeons, police officers, and pretending to be them is quite traditional ground for a con man. They like being figures of authority, someone who is respected in the community.
This is oxygen to this person. He obviously needs this to feel that he's in any way, shape at all important or validated. You've got to feel a bit sorry for him. He's obviously a deeply, deeply inadequate and pathetic character.
It wasn't just doctors Hammond impersonated. He strangely also adopted the personas of high-ranking police officials.
I mean, what was unusual about him as a con man is that he actually seemed drawn to and fascinated by the police. I mean, most con men, obviously, by their very nature, keep away from the police, but he seemed to like getting in touch with them.
I think a lot of his knowledge of the police came from his various dealings with police officers, and some of the names that he used were names of officers that had previously arrested him, so he would know who they were and where they were attached. And a lot of the terminology that he used would be similar to what one would hear on police dramas such as The Bill.
Impersonating policemen was not a new weapon in Michael Hammond's conman artillery. The first record of him adopting the persona of a police officer can be traced back to 1987, followed by another astounding instance in 1999, for which he served 6 months in Wandsworth Prison. But between September 2003 and August 2004, Hammond's obsession with the police and pretending to be a police officer spiraled out of control, resulting in an astonishing 133 bogus calls to police constabularies around the UK.
Mr. Hammond contacted the local police to where he was living and told them that there were men armed with shotguns trying to break into his home address.
And of course the police have got to respond. You can't make a value judgment there and then and say, well, this obviously sounds a load of rubbish, we're not going to bother. You have to respond, that's what the police are there for.
So the local police, in conjunction with armed support, went to his home address. They spoke to Mr. Hammond, who was partially intoxicated, and left the area. No offences being discovered.
There's no financial gain, so it's very difficult for most of us to understand why someone would want to do that. But it is about power and manipulation and seeing yourself as being better than others and being able to control what they do, manipulate people. And clearly he got some sort of real kick out of doing that.
You know, the way that other people would maybe watch the TV or play card games, his idea of a pastime would be to phone up the police, usually after he'd had a bit to drink, and say that maybe an armed assailant was in his home, and the police would then, again, dutifully, they have to respond to these things, turn out with armed guards to try and save him.
And I think what's happening is that he's becoming less inhibited, he's becoming less calculated in how he cons and how he manipulates, and actually what he's doing are just very crude behaviours, crude attempts to gain some sort of attention.
Michael Hammond's twisted bid for attention was spiralling out of control. Despite still mixing with the showbiz set, he was consistently offending, including a police charge for drink driving on the 10th of February 2004, and just 10 days later he made his next bogus police call. Hammond was once again contacting the police pretending to be an officer, only this time he had upped the ante, creating a national security alert.
He calls the police saying that 2 black men are acting suspiciously in Downing Street with firearms.
He pretended to be an officer with Trident, the aspect of the police force that deals with black-on-black crime. And he said that he saw in McDonald's near number 10 Downing Street a group of black gentlemen who he believed were involved in crime.
And those black lads were searched on the ground at gunpoint. One of them was taken into a police vehicle and searched. It was an enormously frightening experience for all of them, and of course they were completely and totally innocent.
Obviously, it was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and somebody could end up being shot by mistake. That's without the sort of time, effort put into it by the police, and the fact somebody else could have needed the services of those police officers at the same time, and it just wasn't available because they were sorting out Hammond.
And at that particular moment, when he's phoning the police, he wants to believe that he is somebody incredibly important. What's more important than somebody who is actually tipping off the police on an issue of national security? He's just engaged in his own fantasy life. He's just engaged in his own need to be somebody. Because who is Michael Hammond? Actually, he's nobody.
The implication is that to truly revel in his fantasy life, Michael Hammond would have to see the results of his actions, just to confirm how important he is. 10 minutes after making his twisted call to the police, Hammond called a second time, claiming to be from Operation Trident, confirming the unit was at the scene. The case seems undeniable. Hammond was watching his warped fantasies unfold.
He was certainly never found at the scene, though one would speculate that there's hardly much point in doing it if you're not going to observe it, but there was no evidence that he did.
There is evidence cataloguing Hammond's compulsive police calls, proving they spanned the following 4 months. As bizarre and childish as his crimes seem, they were bolstered by the use of alcohol, drugs, and the need for attention and power, and his criminal acts were growing in numbers and on the verge of obsessive. But like in the past, Michael Hammond's need to be seen as somebody important and someone who moves in the highest of social circles set off a chain reaction of events that led to his inevitable downfall. Once again, Hammond's obsession with the royal family came to the fore, and he set his sights on infiltrating Windsor Castle by creating a web of lies and impersonating a police officer.
On the 17th of May 2004, Mr. Hammond contacted the control room at Windsor Castle, identifying himself as a Detective Superintendent Sam Morgan. He said that he was in company with two celebrity friends of Prince Harry and Prince William. They were well known to the public and wanted access for them through an entrance other than the public could use.
The name of the officer that he decided to use was the name of an officer he happened to have remembered from the newspaper. So it's not like he just made up a name. He usually used a specific, and that was one of the reasons why he was such a convincing con man generally. And he stayed in the ground. He didn't actually gain access to the building for the best part of an hour. And it was only when he was seen behaving rather oddly on the CCTV cameras that he was actually detained.
He was arrested at the castle for one matter of impersonating police and obtaining a service by deception.
Hammond was taken to Heathrow Police Station and interviewed by Sergeant Neil John.
I remember walking up to Mr. Hammond in the custody suite and introducing myself and telling him that he would have to have his fingerprints taken because that's standard practice to ensure we know exactly who we're dealing with. And I remember asking Mr. Hammond had he ever had his fingerprints taken, and him replying he hadn't. Needless to say, within a very short space of time, his true identity, which was Michael Hammond, came back, together with the fact that he had over 102 convictions dating back to 1982, and as you might imagine, his fingerprints had been taken almost as many times. Myself and my team then started to look into the background of Mr. Hammond, and it was at that point then we discovered this was one of many instances where Mr. Hammond had been purporting to be a police officer.
The game was up, but Michael Hammond couldn't let go of the fantasy that he was a somebody.
He said that he was a famous TV presenter. I remember searching his home address, and there were various pictures on the wall with him in the company of Prince Charles was one of them. Chevy Chase was another. His telephone book had telephone numbers of Danny Minogue, Kylie Minogue, a whole host of TV celebrities. There was some way, there was some connection with him.
And once in police custody, Michael Hammond's mobile phone was the key to unlocking the full extent of his relentless and dangerous 12-month scam.
They subsequently looked through his mobile phone records and found that over 133 calls had been made to different police stations all over the UK.
And the calls varied considerably from anything to do with drugs, firearms, or even one incident where he was alleging that he was following a paedophile.
The Windsor Castle incident became high-profile news, and ironically, Hammond found himself for the first time the legitimate focus of the press. But Hammond couldn't help but revel in the press attention and turn his crime into a fantastical tale when he was released on bail.
Hammond was absolutely relentless in that actually, when it was brought very much to his attention that he'd been wasting police time and nobody's buying his pathetic stories, he still continued. Such was his need to view himself, I think, as important and have other people view him as important.
He saw himself as a confidant of the royal family, a man more sinned against than sinning, and a man who somehow was doing the royal family a favour, because what he thought he had done that day was actually expose a weakness in the royal family's security arrangements. And he also claimed, for good measure, that Prince Charles and him had actually spoken about this matter, and indeed Charles had intimated to him that members of the SAS should in fact be involved in protecting the royal family. So it was the usual sort of mixture of information that perhaps he might have culled from the cuttings about Charles's view on security, and of course this perennial need he has, this continual need he has to see himself as the hero of the hour.
I mean, this is somebody who has such a need that it doesn't matter what you say to him. You can be absolutely blatant. No, Michael, you're not important, we don't buy you, and he won't be able to accept that. He won't be able to face that, because to face it, he would have to accept that he is a nobody, and he would crumble, I think.
Michael Hammond's conman career was spent scamming the police and celebrity world in equal measures.
It's clear right from the beginning he doesn't seem to have that sort of sense of right and wrong.
A blagger isn't someone who's breaking the law. Later on, Michael went on to do that.
We get to see this dark side of Hammond moved from the celebrity world into the police world.
This is somebody who doesn't have an identity of his own. It's fluid, it's shifting, he creates identities by the moment, it seems.
By 2004, Michael Hammond's lies had caught up with him after posing as a policeman in order to gain entry to Windsor Castle. Despite plaguing the police with bogus and potentially life-threatening calls, he still hadn't given up preying upon the celebrity world. Astonishingly, less than a week after being released on bail, Hammond targeted his next celebrity event, the Celebrity Soccer 6 charity event. He found himself a kit and blagged his way onto a team. The organisers hadn't invited Hammond to appear and were baffled by the recently released criminal's presence.
Now, anybody who doesn't have a narcissistic personality disorder is going to be incredibly embarrassed and probably go to ground. What he does is actually he blags his way into a charity football match. He's not been invited, he's just shown up in full kit. What is that about? I mean, clearly, even when Michael has a policeman saying to him, "Oi, mate, you nicked, this behaviour's not acceptable," he's relentless in still pursuing this fame that he wants so badly.
But not all of his scams were frivolous. In spite of being on bail, he once again revealed his dark side and pulled his most ruthless police scam yet.
Next, in July 2004, we see our man Hammond on a P&O ferry going back and forwards to France. On both trips, he calls police claiming to be an Interpol officer, and on one occasion actually accuses a family, an Iraqi family on the boat, of being Al-Qaeda representatives.
Hammond had an earphone in, wired for sound. He quickly opened his jacket to show me had some sort of radio communication. He said he'd already been in contact with UKIS, United Kingdom Immigration Service, based in Croydon, which was factual, they are based there. So he had the right sound bites for things. He inferred that the gentleman and his family were connected to Al-Qaeda, smuggling into the country with potential bomb threats.
Well, as you can imagine, this triggered somewhat of a security alert. And the poor family, who, once again emphasised, perfectly innocent, were searched and detained, children very upset.
So Hammond again is manipulating the truth, i.e. the environment, the fact that Al-Qaeda was something that was in the news at the time, and playing on the fears of the public and also the heightened awareness of the police in order to extremely distress that family.
You could argue there was a slight racist element in some of these people that he tended to target and whose lives he tended to make, unpleasant for a period of time.
So that was actually committed whilst he was on bail for the incursion into Windsor Castle.
It wasn't long before the police realised that their supposed Interpol informant was serial scammer Hammond, who was on bail awaiting trial at the time for the Windsor Castle incident. And on the 4th of February 2005, Michael Hammond's date in court finally arrived to face the latest charges in an inexhaustible criminal career.
The evidence against Mr. Hammond was dare I say it, overwhelming in all the incidents that we investigated.
In terms of the number of offences he's committed, 102 previous convictions were mentioned. And I suspect that was the tip of the iceberg, if I'm honest. And he probably did a lot of other stuff as well. But the fact he accepted that suggests that there were probably more.
Hammond pleaded guilty to 1 charge of public nuisance and asked for an additional 16 charges relating to his bogus police calls to be taken into account. Despite the public revelation of Hammond's twisted fantasies, he seemed to revel in the attention.
Hammond, in a strange way, I think rather enjoyed it. I think, he did finally find himself on a stage, with so many people looking at him. And I got the impression, he rather dressed up, his hair looked immaculate, he looked well groomed, he was rather enjoying it. I think the thing about him is ultimately he was really a frustrated actor, and there he was playing a part again. He had his audience.
One member of Hammond's audience did not enjoy the performance.
The judge took it very seriously indeed, and I don't think he found it the least bit amusing. I think a lot of the journalists who were covering it, a lot of the coverage that you saw in the newspapers, showed that there was some levity among the media people who were there, because they did think it was a rather entertaining case because of the illustrious names that were being mentioned and so on. So there was a slight sort of disconnect between the judge and the media people.
Well, the judge in sentencing Hammond drew attention to how frightening it is to have police officers drawing firearms in public, not only to the people whom they may be challenging, but to everybody else. Of course, it's not like the films. These are real guns with real bullets, with real human beings. And it must have been enormously frightening for these people who, I emphasise, were completely and utterly innocent.
Before sentencing Hammond to 4.5 years in prison, the judge acknowledged that he may be in need of psychological help and had no choice to impose a custodial sentence due to the severity of Hammond's crimes. He also commented that Hammond's desire to exercise power and gain attention were no doubt enhanced by his excessive use of alcohol and tranquilizers. Speaking directly to Hammond, the judge also stated, "Quite apart from the distress and fear that must have been caused to these people, you created the risk of something much worse. You could not possibly know how those being searched would behave or react, and however well trained or disciplined armed officers are, the necessity for carrying and producing loaded weapons in such circumstances inevitably carries with it a risk that an action or a reaction may be misunderstood with tragic consequences. Fortunately, that did not happen. You had no way of knowing whether it might or not." Michael Hammond was sent to Mount Prison in Hemel Hempstead.
The saddest, if you like, of Michael Hammond is he had talent, and if he had put his energies and time into being legit and using the natural talent he had, he could have been successful.
I imagine that the thrill he gets from it is exercising some degree of power. He can pretend that he's an important man. He's caused all of these people to rush around as a result of his actions and his commands.
As far as I'm aware, as investigations go, it was unprecedented in the extent of all the various hoaxes that Mr. Hammond completed over that period.
Oh, I'm sure there's a lot more action to come before the final credits come down on this man's life. I think he is a natural performer. I don't think he can help it, poor chap. And I think we will hear a lot more from him.
And true to form, following his release from prison for the Windsor Castle incident, Hammond did go on to disturbingly re-offend. On the 27th of March 2008, Michael Hammond walked into Kensington Tube Station in London and began shouting "Al-Qaeda," and heartlessly pretended to have a bomb in his bag, striking fear into the large crowd on the platform. In September 2008, at Blackfriars Crown Court, Hammond pleaded guilty to communicating false information about a bomb hoax and sending a false message to cause annoyance. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. The authorities hope this time he has learned his lesson.